Reflections with theologian Father James Bacik, campus minister and assistant professor of philosophy at Bowling Green State University in Bowling Green, Ohio.
Cross remains, a paradox for us, and it's really the symbol for all of us of life as we know it and the struggles of life. I see in those two words the model for how we need to try to deal with our lives. And we're saying, it's hard, Father. I'm in the darkness. Out of the depths I cry to you. I've got these problems and difficulties, and yet I trust you. I commend my spirit to you.
Joining Father Bacik in today's reflections is Pam Meseral, a former colleague of Father Bacik at St. Thomas More University Parish in Bowling Green, Ohio. Today's Reflections focuses on the topic of the death of Jesus. Here's Father Bacik.
Pam, thanks for coming and speaking with me today. As you know, working at St. Thomas More with me, that a lot of us on the staff end up dealing with people's problems. We have a lot of times when people come in with their difficulties and are distressed in one way or another. People suffering from a lot of anxiety, people with marital problems, personal kinds of problems, needing to deal with people who are sick and encountering death and so on. I suppose a lot of the work in the pastoral ministry deals with the harsh side of life and the darkness of life. And it's important for us to find ways to deal with that. To cope with the difficulties and struggles of life, to find some enlightenment in the midst of all of that darkness. And for us Christians, we really look to Jesus Christ for that kind of enlightenment, and I suppose especially the part of our Lord's life and His passion and His death help us to understand a bit about the minor kind of crosses that we carry in life, and suggest ways for us to deal with that. So I would like to today speak a little bit about the passion and the death of Jesus Christ, and trying to do it in relationship to our problems in life and how we might find some encouragement and hope in dealing with them. I suppose the first thing about the whole business of Jesus' death is that He did it freely. We have, especially in Mark's Gospel, the picture that Jesus is up in the northern part of His country in Galilee and is preaching to the people up there, and that there seems to be a need on His part to go down into the capital city of Jerusalem in order to complete His mission or to fill His responsibilities to meeting the will of the Father. There is that remembrance in the Gospels that His disciples really didn't want Him to do that. Jesus says we must go to Jerusalem, but they tried to talk Him out of it. There is this, and He treats that as a temptation and says, well, you Satans, get behind me. And instead, as Luke makes so clear, He sets His face on Jerusalem and goes there freely. Now, He does that knowing that he can well get in trouble. There's really three different sources of that kind of difficulty. First, there is the problem of the Herodians, the party of Herod Antipas, who would be out to get him, much as they did get John the Baptist. So we know the Baptist was beheaded, and there was a possibility that Jesus could be put out of the way by the Herodians in the same way. The second group that really had a power to deal with him was the Sanhedrin, the official ruling body of the Jewish people, and they were worried about him undercutting their authority, and they had the power, based on their scriptures, Deuteronomy 17:12, I think it is, that they had the power to stone people to death who in one way or another subverted their authority. And so he had to be wary of them. And then there's also, of course, the Roman occupying force, represented by Pontius Pilate, the governor, who would be leery of him as being some sort of guerrilla fighter or political revolutionary, and he could get in trouble with them. So the point is that he seemed to go to Jerusalem even though he knew all of the troubles that awaited him there. One of the theories is that his own mission in Galilee to the Jewish people as a whole was not going well, that there was a lot of failure connected with that, and that he felt the need to go into the capital city and to meet the authorities on their own ground and to try to preach the word there. So I think that I get something out of all of that in terms of dealing with the darkness of life, about this business of meeting one's responsibilities and trying to really deal with the darkness in a constructive way, and that even when life is a struggle and a difficult thing, that we have to try to meet that and face it directly and not and sort of refuse to escape and going off in other directions. You think that it's possible to make that real to people, or to present that in some way, or are you following what I'm trying to say there?
Yes, I think the fact that he did die freely and that he faced those temptations is a very significant example for us in our lives today. I think it is possible.
Yes, it certainly ought to give us some sort of encouragement. We're always saying as Christian people that we need somehow to find meaning in our life. We need that kind of encouragement, and we say that we find it in Jesus of Nazareth. And it seems to me that's one of the concrete ways. Of course, one of the premises of that is that we realize that Jesus was like us in all things except sin, as Paul suggested to us, that he's a real human being. And I think when we deal with these accounts of the passion and the death of the Lord, that it's important to see it in that realistic way, to see the cultural setting, to see the real problems that he faced, and so on. I think that this proves to be very helpful. And when we see him as truly human, then we can say, hey, here's a model, an example. And in going to Jerusalem, he truly is a model of courage, great strength, even in the midst of the worst kinds of troubles, that his impending death. Now perhaps we can go to the next event here, which would be the fact that he had a final meal with his disciples. Really is a little difference of opinion in the Gospels on that. When it occurred, the synoptic Gospels, that is Matthew, Mark, and Luke, have that occurring on the day of Passover and put it all in a Passover context. And John's Gospel, it occurs on the day before the Passover. But whatever the actual fact of that, and many scholars, I think, lean to the idea that it would be the day before Passover, because it would be hard to imagine all of these legal trials going on the very day of Passover. Whatever we say about the dating of it, the significance of it is clear, that it is this final meal with his disciples in which he makes it clear that he's giving himself to them and for them. I think there's a good indication in there that he does see any troubles that are impending, or his impending death, as truly being having a bearing on their salvation. He's giving himself for them. And of course, we continue to try to remember this in the Lord's Supper and in the Eucharist and in the Mass. I suppose one of our problems always is to bring out a lot of these meanings. One of the things we say is the Lord's Supper is a remembrance of the Last Supper of the Lord. It is the time when we are in touch again with his self-giving, when we recall that the kind of fellowship that he enjoyed with his disciples.
You think people really understand the significance of the Last Supper in the Eucharist?
Well, I'm sure what I think happens is that we all see it in different ways, and it probably means something different to us at various times, so that when we sometimes, I suppose especially during the what we call Holy Week, or we're celebrating the Holy Thursday, probably a great part of our mind is on the past, and I think people probably do get in touch with that in some ways. But I think it all depends on the experience we bring to it and the mood we're in. I think sometimes people come to celebrate the Eucharist and they're very joyful, and it's a time, boy, to give thanks to God for all of the blessings. And I think other times it might be a great sadness and anxiety we bring to it, and saying, boy, what a terrible week we've had, and nothing but troubles, and I really have to get hold of that and get some meaning out of it. So maybe that occurs as well. I think other times it really is a fellowship thing, that we just would like to be with people who share our values. and who can support us in the struggles and be with us in the joys of life. And I think that a lot of the times the Eucharist can function that way. So I can see many different meanings, and I think probably people just get out of it whatever their current experience brings to it, or maybe their training. But here when we're looking at the Last Supper, I suppose we're remembering that fellowship idea. It really was a last gathering with his good friends. I think that has great significance. One can almost feel the emotion that must have existed at that time, and to think this is the last time they're going to share that kind of meal in the Lord's earthly existence. So a lot of friendship. I call you no longer servants, but I call you friends, he says. I think that's maybe one of the things that ought to characterize the Eucharist for us. Okay, let's turn now to what we traditionally call the agony in the garden. What we find is that there's sort of different portrayals of that in the various Gospels. Pam, you have in front of you what we call a gospel harmony that tries to take the four Gospels and put them side by side. And in doing that, we see how each of the evangelists write from a little different perspective about these last events. Why don't you read something from there? Would you read Mark's account where they are in the agony of the garden and Jesus is reprimanding them for the fact that they were falling asleep? Would you read that to us?
Sure. Then he came and found them sleeping. And he said to Peter, Simon, dost thou sleep? Couldn't thou not watch 1 hour?
Okay, so in other words, we get sort of a harsh portrayal of that. Once you read it, there's a corresponding section in Luke, I think, that gives just a little bit different flavor to it.
And rising from prayer, he came to the disciples and found them sleeping for sorrow.
Yeah, it's interesting, that word sorrow. Now, this is typical of Luke, where he tries to always put sort of a better interpretation on things. He doesn't want them to really look bad in any way. So he says, well, they fell asleep for sorrow. You can see that throughout the accounts. Luke is the one who tells us that when Peter cuts off the ear of the one fellow who's come out to arrest Jesus, that Luke says, well, then he healed the ear. He always wants to put the whole scene in sort of a better light. He has a great compassion and so on. And so we see that difference here in this portrayal of the agony in the garden. But the real significance, I think, of all of that is that Jesus indeed is distressed over all. He's going through a real human emotion. He's upset in one way or another with what is happening. But on the other hand, he has this absolute assurance that God is with him, that there is some sort of comfort and strength for him available. And that's what comes out in the full story there of the agony in the garden. Let's look at another part of that scene when Jesus finally is taken captive. And I'll show you again how there really is a difference in the way the evangelists portray this. We could probably this time contrast Mark and John in the way they see this arrest account. Now, why don't you read from Mark's account there in the harmony, first of all.
And while he was yet speaking, Judas Iscariot, one of the 12, came, and with a great crowd with swords and clubs, from the chief priests and the scribes and the elders. Now his betrayer had given them a sign, saying, Whomever I kiss, that is he, lay hold of him and lead him safely away. And when he came, he went straight up to him and said, Rabbi, and kissed him. And they seized him and held him.
A very poignant kind of scene. One of the things that you see there is that there's Jesus is sort of at their mercy in a way. He is seized by them. Another thing that you'll notice in the passage is that these are all Jewish groups that came out to get him. The indication would be that it was the Jewish temple police, perhaps, that came out to arrest Jesus. But in Mark's gospel, it is totally a Jewish kind of affair, and they are very much in control of the situation there. Now, why don't you read John's account? Now, John doesn't have that kind of sorrowing picture at all of the agony in the garden. He doesn't portray that, but why don't you read the passage now from John where they do come out to arrest him.
Judas, then taking the cohort and the attendants from the chief priests and Pharisees, came there with lanterns and torches and weapons. Jesus therefore, knowing all that was to come upon him, went forth and said to them, Whom do you seek? They answered him, Jesus of Nazareth. Jesus said to them, I am he. Now Judas, who betrayed him, was also standing with them. When therefore he said to them, I am he, they drew back and fell to the ground.
Okay, why don't we stop right there? Now, you notice a couple things about that portrayal in John's Gospel. For example, one thing is that you have the cohort, the Roman group is in the scene. John seems to indicate that the Romans were in on this plot to get Jesus right from the start, which is interesting. It's very debated in scholarly circles which portrayal really is true here. But it's very surprising that John would have that in this passage, especially since he was writing it in the late 1st century when the Christian people were having a great deal of trouble with the Romans and where they didn't really want to anger the Romans excessively. So we do have a Roman influence. But the other thing that we see here is Jesus' total command. What John wants to bring out really is that Jesus is in control of the situation. He's the king all the way through John's Gospel. He and the Father are one. Before Abraham was, I am, he says. He's the powerful Lord. And when they come to get him and he speaks right up, he's in command, they fall over. You get a very different kind of portrayal here in these two evangelists. That problem that I've brought up between the Jewish responsibility and the Roman responsibility for Jesus' condemnation and death is one that is greatly argued about in scholarly circles, and perhaps we ought to go into that a little bit. There's a question mainly of who is responsible for this. And I think if I try to put together what a lot of the scholars would end up saying, it would go something like this, that the Jewish people did have a trial before the Sanhedrin, the Jewish leaders, and in which case they attempted to get Jesus on the charge that he was a blasphemer and that he had undercut their authority in some way. But that during the course of that trial, they really could not get a conviction. There were a lot of Jewish people, especially of the Pharisaic Hillel party, who would have been very much in accord with a lot of the things that Jesus was saying. And we have that remembrance of Joseph of Arimathea being a very good man and sort of on Jesus' side. So apparently they could not get a conviction on the grounds that Jesus was this false prophet and blasphemer. And so they resorted then to another technique, and that is they suggested that they would hand Jesus over to the Romans to be tried by them. They did it with the insinuation that Jesus was politically dangerous. We get the remembrance of that is that he is somehow against the Roman Empire, and that Pilate better be careful. They put pressure on Pilate that way to convict him, because otherwise Pilate will not be seen in a good light by the Roman emperor. So what seems to happen is then that they hand him over to Pontius Pilate, who is the Roman governor who ran the area that we know as Judea, while Herod Antipas was the ruler in Galilee. And Herod would have been in the city of Jerusalem because it was the holy days. He usually was in Caesarea Philippi where he did his judging, but he would have come there. And that the Jews took advantage of Pilate's weakness. Historically, he is known to be a very cruel and weak kind of leader, not a noble person by any means. In fact, the Romans removed him from office in 36 after Jesus' own death. But then Pilate tries him in a Roman fashion, and he is eventually convicted of being a political revolutionary, of being a guerrilla type, somebody who's undercutting their authority. And that is the charge eventually that he was convicted on, and that is what he was executed for. We get a remembrance of that in the inscription on the cross, that he made himself the King of the Jews, having a political kind of implication, therefore. So it is interesting to see about this trial. I think it has great bearing, really, on a lot of Christian-Jewish dialogue today. It's important that Christians understand that the Jewish people as a whole are not responsible for the death of Jesus. It's important that Christians realize that we're dealing with a small group of leaders, and that even among the leaders there was not unanimity that Jesus ought to be condemned, and especially that there is a large Roman role in this condemnation and execution of Jesus. I think that's important so that Christians do not get a faulty attitude towards Jewish people, or that old terrible charge of deicide, that they are God killers, needs to be put aside once and for all. And fortunately, in the Catholic community, in the Second Vatican Council, we dealt rather decisively with that issue. And I think it's one of the reasons for keeping this history in mind is so that we have a good ecumenical kind of outlook on that. You following that about the trial then?
Yes, yes.
Okay, then maybe we ought to move to the business of the crucifixion and death of the Lord. The idea is that Jesus was taken outside of the walls of Jerusalem and was executed there. A place called Calvary, is meaning the skull place. You get the evangelists each put in a little different details about how that goes on. If we try to reconstruct the way it was done at that time, crucifixion was a terrible form of punishment. It was done for slaves and political insurrectionists. And it was done as an example to the people. They executed him outside of the walls, I suppose, where people would be walking by. There would be passerbys, and that in order to serve as an example that people shouldn't get involved in that kind of activity. So it was an ignominious kind of death. Common thing was to have the criminal carry out the horizontal beam, that the vertical beam would already be out there, and he would carry out the horizontal beam and then be tied up to there. The way they usually died was of suffocation, therefore, that they couldn't support themselves anymore, and the full weight of their body would come down and would end up suffocating them. We have the idea, though, that Jesus was crucified. Perhaps that was that his nails pounded through his hands. Perhaps that was part of the business of hurrying up the process in order that he would lose blood. It's also, you get that remembrance of breaking their legs to hurry it up, so they couldn't support themselves with their legs anymore, and that therefore their full weight would come down and they would die of that kind of suffocation. I think it's important to realize what Jesus was saying at the end. We have those famous last words of Jesus. The ones that always capture my imagination really are from Psalm 22, where he says, "Father, why have you forsaken me?" I think it's a reminder again that Jesus goes to his death in darkness, that he needs to be a man of faith himself, that he was so lost his friends, his disciples didn't support him in this terrible hour. Here he is, an innocent person and crucified as a political revolutionary, which he was not, because he always insisted on nonviolence. So in all these ways, it's a terrible, desolate kind of time, and the words of the psalm seems to capture some of that terrible thing that Jesus was going through. But then the other words, "Father, into your hands I commend my spirit." It seems to me that captures the positive side of the tremendous faith that Jesus had. In the midst of all this, his cause seems to be down the drain. The kingdom which he had fought for doesn't seem to be being established, and yet he trusts completely in his Father, the one he called Abba, and he commends his spirit. He actively gives himself over in death, thereby reconciling all of us with the Father. So it is a terrible moment in history in a sense, and yet it is the moment of victory and of exultation. Cross remains a paradox for us, and it's really the symbol for all of us of life as we know it and the struggles of life. I see in those two words the model for how we need to try to deal with our lives, and we're saying, it's hard, Father. I'm in the darkness. Out of the depths I cry to you. I've got these problems and difficulties, and yet I trust you. I commend my spirit to you. I think that, too, we need to understand a little bit about the meaning of this death. I don't think that today it's very good to think about it as a sacrifice appeasing an angry God. I don't think that's the way we really ought to think about it. I think rather that we should realize that God is one who wants to save us. God is on our side. He's not an angry God. He's a loving God. And through the whole history of mankind, He's been trying to save us. But He really has saved us because this Jesus has been saved by the Father. This Jesus who has obediently given His life over to the Father has been rewarded by the Father. And so that the union between us humans and God is now made irrevocable. It's irreversible. We are forever close to God, and it can't be changed because one of us, the best that we have ever produced, has given himself wholly over to the Father and has been saved by the Father. And in that salvation of Jesus, we are all saved. So Jesus is the true God and the true man, the mediator between us and the Father. And I think that when the disciples encountered this whole thing, we got to remember how dispirited they were. When they saw it, historically, they were terribly upset about the whole thing. They thought the cause is lost. There's no place to go with all of this now. And here they felt terrible about it, let down. And that's the scene we end up with in the passion and death narratives. Jesus taken down from the cross, buried, and the disciples totally upset. And that can only ever be seen or talked about for us Christians in the light of the resurrection, because that's the next stage. The next step in all of this is our absolute belief that the cause of Jesus was vindicated, that He was raised to life, that the whole death was for the sake of the resurrection. We celebrate Good Friday only for the sake of Easter. So Christianity ends up being not a masochistic kind of religion, but a religion of victory and of triumph. And I think so as we talk all about the passion and death, it's always in light of the resurrection of Jesus.
You've been listening to Reflections with your host, theologian Father James Bacik, campus minister and assistant professor of philosophy at Bowling Green State University in Bowling Green, Ohio. Joining Father Bacik in this discussion was Pam Meserol, a former colleague of Father Bacik at St. Thomas More University Parish in Bowling Green, Ohio. The topic of this week's reflections was the death of Jesus. If you have any questions about today's program or any ideas for topics you'd like to hear discussed, please write to Reflections in care of WLQR, Toledo, Ohio 43623. Produced in the studios of WLQR, Reflections is directed by Mark Ferguson. Executive producer is Mary Beth Kirchner. Reflections is brought to you by the Genesis Radio Network.